Greetings and welcome, everyone, on the World Wide Web. We have James Aitken Wylie's book, The History of Protestantism, today. I'm joined with Michael in Germany, and a warm welcome to you, Michael, today.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Brad. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to the continuation of the series, which I estimate could take a little bit longer.
Yeah, a little bit longer with 2,000 pages. And of course, your host here reading the pages. I'm doing this as a service for everyone. I'm learning along with everyone. I'm not claiming to be any authority here at all. I'm just your servant. So it's great to be here with you, Michael, and I'm really glad that we can touch on this. And obviously this is not going to be a very popular topic, I think, in terms of modern society. They're more interested in, the same old Roman ploy, right? Bread and circus.
Mm-hmm.
But hey,
your bread and me a circus.
Well, hey, we started, some weeks ago on the premise of, well, this is something that is a very interesting topic. And of course, this is the target that the Counter-Reformation has been pursuing to destroy in the world. So, to me, it makes much more sense to be reading this book than many other topics that I can think of, because this is really essentially what this entire Counter-Reformation has been trying to eliminate from the world. And no wonder, I mean, you don't really see the churches teaching or the churches talking about their history very much. I'm thinking that they have a lot more to hide than to share, these modern churches we have to live with. And I simply do not agree with a lot of the teachings that are in a lot of these modern churches. They just fail to look at their history thoroughly, Michael. I just see it everywhere I look. Or they might look at the history, but they twist it like some other institution we've studied, and that's really never been my intention to go that direction. I've always been wanting to look at these critical topics and to treat them accordingly, that they are important. This history is very important, and it does have a place in my heart, and I hope many others. But who knows? It could be that we've reached a point of no return as far as the Jesuits are concerned. And hey, there's always time for repentance as far as I'm concerned. People can and do change their minds. So God hasten the day for all of you Roman folk out there to take a listen and consider very carefully what the Spirit has to say about the Roman Church, because it's a very serious thing. It's not something to take lightly. A lot of different churches are, intertwined with the Catholic Church, whether they know it or not. A lot of institutions are intertwined with the workings of Romanism without knowing it. And the quicker they become aware of this history, the more apt they are to be prepared for what's coming. But back to James Aitken Wylie. In the book, we are on Chapter 4, the development of the papacy from Gregory VII to Boniface VIII. Okay? And we will proceed. Is there anything you'd like to contribute, Michael, before we depart into the chapter?
Not yet.
Okay, great. Well, here we go. Development of the papacy from Gregory VII to Boniface VIII. We come now to the last great struggle. There lacked one grade of power to complete and crown this stupendous fabric of dominion. The spiritual supremacy was achieved in the 7th century. The temporal sovereignty was attained in the 8th. It wanted only the pontifical supremacy, sometimes, although improperly, styled the temporal supremacy, to make the Pope supreme over kings, as he had already become over peoples and bishops, and to vest in him a jurisdiction that has not its like on earth, a jurisdiction that is unique inasmuch as it arrogates all powers, absorbs all rights, and spurns all limits, destined before terminating its career to crush beneath its iron foot thrones and nations, and masking an ambition as astute as Lucifer's with a dissimulation as profound. This power advanced at first with noiseless steps and stole upon the world as night steals upon it. But as it neared the goal of its strides, grew longer and swifter, till at last it vaulted over the throne of monarchs into the seat of God. This great war we shall now proceed to consider. When the popes at an early stage claimed to be the vicars of Christ, they virtually challenged that boundless jurisdiction of which their proudest era beheld them in actual possession. But they knew that it would be imprudent, indeed impossible as yet to assert it in actual fact. Their motto was spes messis in semine, discerning, quote, at the harvest in the seed, unquote. They were content, meanwhile, to lodge the principle of supremacy in their creed, and in general mind of Europe, and in the general mind of Europe, knowing that future ages would fructify and ripen it. Towards this, they began to work quietly, yet skillfully and perseveringly. At length came to overt and open measures. It was now the year 1073. The papal chair was filled by perhaps the greatest of all the popes, Gregory VII, the noted Hildebrand. Daring and ambitious beyond all who preceded, and beyond most of those who have followed him on the papal throne, Gregory fully grasped the great idea of theocracy. He held that the reign of the Pope was but another name for the reign of God, and he resolved never to rest till that idea had been realized in the subjection of all authority and power, spiritual and temporal, to the chair of Peter. Quote, when he drew out, unquote, says Janus, quote, the whole system of papal omnipotence in 27 theses in his Dictatus. These theses were partly mere repetitions or corollaries of the Isidorian decretals. Partly he and his friends sought to give them the appearance of tradition and antiquity by new fictions, unquote. We may take the following as samples. The 11 maxims say, quote, the Pope's name is the chief name in the world. The 12th teaches that, quote, it is lawful for him to depose emperors, unquote. The 18th affirms that, quote, his decision to be withstood by none, but he alone may annul those of all men, unquote. The 19th declares that, quote, he can be judged by no one, unquote. The 25th vests him in absolute power of deposing and restoring bishops, and the 27th, the power of annulling all allegiance of subjects. Such was the gauge that Gregory flung down to the kings and nations of the world. We say of the world, for the pontifical supremacy embraces all who dwell upon the earth. Now began the war between the mitre and the empire. Gregory's object in this war being to wrest from the emperors the power of appointing the bishops and the clergy generally, and to assume into his own soul irresponsible hands, the whole of that intellectual and spiritual machinery by which Christendom was governed. The strife was a bloody one. The mitre, though sustaining occasional reverses, continued nevertheless to gain steadily upon the empire. The spirit of the times helped the priesthood in their struggle with the civil power. The age was superstitious to the core, and though in no wise spiritual, it was very thoroughly ecclesiastical. Okay? And I want to come back to this perhaps at the end of the session, because I think right now would not be a good time to go into the great detail here. But we'll do that at the end of the session. The age was superstitious to the core, and though no wise spiritual, it was very thoroughly ecclesiastical. The Crusades, too, broke the spirit and drained the wealth of the princes, while the growing power and augmenting riches of the clergy cast the balance ever more and more against the state. For a brief space, Gregory VII tasted in his own case the luxury of wielding this more than mortal power. There came a gleam, though, the awful darkness of the tempest that he raised, not final victory, which was yet a century distant, but its presage. He had the satisfaction of seeing the Emperor Henry IV of Germany, who he had smitten with excommunication, barefooted and in raiment of sackcloth, waiting 3 days and nights at the castle gates of Canossa amid the winter's drifts, suing for forgiveness. But it was for a moment only that Hildebrand stood at this dazzling pinnacle. The fortune of war very quickly turned. Henry, the man whom the Pope had sorely humiliated, became victor in his turn. Gregory died in exile on the promontory of Salerno, but his successors espoused his project and strove by wiles, by arms, and by anathemas to reduce the world under the scepter of the papal theocracy. For well nigh 2 dismal centuries the conflict was maintained. How truly melancholy the record of these times! It exhibits to our sorrowing gaze many a stricken field, many an empty throne, many a city sacked, many a spot deluged with blood. Exclamation point. Now, Michael, did you want to make a comment on Henry
Yeah,
IV?
yeah. As I told you last time also about the Henry IV, it's very interesting, especially from a German standpoint, because, this Henry IV was the German king. And isn't it interesting that almost everybody knows the expression here, the walk to Canossa, which is then the Italian location of the Pope, or was, but nobody talks about the papal supremacy against the worldly rulers. They treat this event as a kind of, that was a long time ago, but nobody sees the resemblance to the actual situation that the Pope can excommunicate any worldly leaders. Therefore, he's just supreme because he can condemn them, and so that everybody is free of any charge who would just murder or slaughter any so-called pagan ruler who does not obey the Pope. And nobody sees the reference to today, or everybody thinks, oh yeah, that's close to 1,000 years ago. That was then, but now we have democracy. So many people know, oh yeah, the walk to Canossa, oh yeah, there was a king who had to go to the Pope and cross the Alps and barefoot. We have been taught this in school, but we were not taught the actual situation or the importance of this event. And so I just would like to point out, this is just an example that the history that's been told is just the history from the victors. And victor means Victoria, means the Roman goddess of victory. So it's also an English word, victory, but actually your word victory comes from a Roman goddess.
No, I never knew that that's common knowledge in Europe, but I suppose, Europe has a lot more history than the States do, obviously, because we're quote unquote a new creation here.
And let's say, Brett, this that was the knowledge in the school 45 years ago.
Right. Got it.
Yeah, yep. When our education system was far more better than today.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. Right. That's interesting. Very
You
interesting.
also have to remember that this Henry IV of the Holy Roman Reich, he was being set in power as the emperor when he was underage. Yeah, so he was born on the 11th of the 11th, so 11th of November 1050. And this incident of the walk to Canossa happened in 1077, so which means that he was 26 something. So what do you know about anything? What do you know about the Bible when you are 26?
Yeah, not a whole lot, I would imagine.
I would also imagine.
Yeah.
But it's really so relevant until today, when you see that all these worldly so-called leaders, which have been put in our face, or just put in front of the television, that they just only play a minor role. But we know that minister just means a servant of the church, when you see it literally in the etymology.
True.
Yeah, but we are just amateurs here. What do we know? You see that these so-called professed people, they will tell that, that is long ago, and now since the French Revolution and the founding of the United States, there is democracy all over the Western world. Sure. That's why the European Union has gathered together all the leaders of the OC, so-called sovereign countries of the European Union have come together then in Rome to sign the Treaty of the European Union in 2004 under the big statue of Pope Innocent.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, yes, that's right. And that was, wasn't that around the year 2000 or something?
2004. I have looked it up last week for research. So it was 2004.
Right. Yeah, that's a striking image, Surely once you've studied these subjects, you just don't forget these things.
I have a hard time imagining that people are... I don't think that the majority of people is so dumbed down, especially not the older ones. I think the problem that we have that will arrive, Brett, is that we are just being more and more getting older, and the younger generations, they are able, and it is legal for them to decide anything, and they will decide on totally wrong foundations. And that's the thing that is really bugging me, that I see that the education system is...
there's movies that have been made about that too. Logan's Run, remember that one? Yeah. So these are ideologies that that our so-called ruling elite want to place in our mind, that they want us to go that way, and they're encouraging that way. But it's really up to those youngsters to do their own research, and some of them do, and some of them are not so foolish to follow this path. that's been laid out. And, you know, who knows? I'm not going to be able to predict the future here, but it could be a different outcome.
Yeah, I don't know. You see that I have a hard time imagining when I told you that this Henry IV was just 26 something when he was just being excommunicated by the Pope. But I think that his struggle that he had with the papacy was more or less about all of money. I have a hard time imagining that it was about faith. So I don't want to count him as a real Protestant, you see?
Right, of course. Of course.
So this is just worldly terms here. Yeah, they are struggling, and they have an argument about actually the money and the position of the emperor, and it's just a question of power.
Yeah, that reminds me of that little bit from history of when, who was it now? Jan Hus was standing up against, you know, the clergy back in his day, and the emperor was forced to bring him to justice, and they put him to the stake. And you know, that's another little portion of history that is very important, because you know,
I think that will also be covered by that book here. But
I think so.
The stress that Henry IV had with the Pope and the other way around is about the investiture controversy or investiture contest, a conflict between the church and the state in medieval Europe over the ability to choose and install bishops and abbots of monasteries and the Pope himself. So it's about that, who's ruling the country.
Well, yeah, and I think we're going to get that right into that in the reading here. So I think it's going.
Yeah, and but it's not. You see that as it is a part of the book, the History of Protestantism. I think that we should really sort out the facts. I have a hard time believing that he, at the age of 26, is a real Bible believer or so. I don't think so. You see that's would be a very rare combination if you are a worldly king and a Bible believer just in one position. So therefore, I think it is just solely to make the point that who's running the show, and it's clearly the Pope running the show. Anyway, you like it.
Well, I think, you know, that's interesting you bring that up, because I think that's really what this life is all about. Is you know, because the Bible does talk about kings that are righteous and that you know, are doing their best to serve God in their authority as a worldly ruler. Certainly, you know, that's something that could happen, but with all of the temptations that come along with it, we see that over and over in history, in the Bible too, that these kings fail. They cannot perform. A man cannot serve two masters, right? So there you go. I mean, it's a very big dilemma that they have to face.
Yeah, and maybe we should also point out the fact, I do not know if it will be content of the reading here of that book, because I have not read that book yet, Brett, that the rulership of Henry IV is extremely close, or the struggle at Canossa, the walk to Canossa in 1077, is so close to Dictatus Papae in 1075. Yeah, so I think that's no coincidence that the papacy then said, okay, now we have promoted that in March 1075, and now there comes this juvenile king or emperor from the Holy Roman Reich of German nations, or whatever that was called in the day. I have not looked it up and have not studied the subject, but I think that is very close, and they needed to set an example.
Yes,
that's my feeling.
Exactly. Yes, that's right, and that's what happened. And yeah,
in
modern times we have other people they had to set as an example, not really the same in any kind of context, really, but you know, you get the drift. Anyway, should we get back to the reading? Okay. Let's see. Okay, so, but through all this confusion and misery, the idea of Gregory was perseveringly pursued till at last it was realized, and the mitre was beheld triumphant over the empire. It was the fortune or the calamity of Innocent III, 1198 through 1216, to celebrate this great victory. Now it was that the pontifical supremacy reached its full development. One man, one will again govern the world. It is with a sort of stupefied awe that we look back to the 13th century and see the foreground of the receding storm, this colossus appearing itself in the person of Innocent III. On its head, all the mitres of the church, and in its hand, all the scepters of the state. Quote, in each of the three leading objects which Rome has pursued, unquote, says Hallam. Quote, independent sovereignty, supremacy over the Christian church, control over the princes of the earth, it was the fortune of this pontiff to conquer, unquote. Quote unquote, Rome, he says again, quote, inspired during this age all the terror of her ancient name. She was once more mistress of the world, and kings were her vassals, unquote. She had fought a great fight, and now she celebrated an unequaled triumph. Innocent appointed all bishops. He summoned to his tribunal all causes, from the gravest affairs of mighty kingdoms to the private concerns of the humble citizen. He claimed all kingdoms as his fiefs and all monarchs as his vessels, and launched with unsparing hands the bolts of excommunication against all who withstood his pontifical will. Hildebrand's idea was now fully realized. The pontifical supremacy was held in its plenitude, the plenitude of spiritual power and that of temporal power. It was the noon of the papacy, but the noon of the papacy was the midnight of the world. The grandeur which the papacy now enjoyed and the jurisdiction it wielded have received dogmatic expression, and one or two selections will enable it to paint itself as it was seen in its noon. Pope Innocent III affirmed, quote, that the pontifical authority so much exceeded the royal power as the sun doth the moon, unquote. Nor could he find words fitly to describe his own formidable functions, save those of Jehovah to his prophet Jeremiah. Quote, see, I have set thee over the nations and over the kingdoms to root out and to pull down and to destroy and to throw down, unquote. Quote, the church is my spouse, unquote. We find the same Pope saying, quote, it is not married, it is not married to me without bringing me something. She hath given me a dowry, a price beyond all price, the plenitude of spiritual things and the extent of things temporal, the greatness and abundance of both. She hath given me the mitre in token of things spiritual, the crown in token of things of the temporal, the mitre of the priesthood, and the crown for the kingdom, making me the lieutenant of him who hath written upon his vesture and on his thigh, quote, King of kings and Lord of lords, unquote. I enjoy alone the plenitude of power that others may say of me next to God, quote, and out of his fullness have we received, unquote. We declare, says Boniface VIII in his bull Unum Sanctum, quote, define, pronounce it to be necessary to salvation for every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff, unquote. And a little comment from me, note the word human, please. This subjection is declared in the bull to extend to all affairs, quote, unquote. One sword, says the Pope, quote, must be under another, and the temporal authority must be subject to the spiritual power. Whence, if the earthly power go astray, it must be judged by the spiritual, unquote. Such are a few of the quote-unquote great words which were heard to issue from the Vatican Mount, that new Sinai, which, like the old, encompassed by fiery terrors, had upreared itself in the midst of the astonished and affrighted nations of Christendom. What a contrast between the first and the last estate of the pastors of the Roman Church, between the humility and poverty of the first century and the splendor and power in which the 13th saw them enthroned. This contrast has not escaped the notice of the greatest of Italian poets. Dante, in one of his lightning flashes, has brought it before us. He describes the first pastors of the church as coming and addressing Peter. He says, quote, and thou wentst forth in poverty and hunger to set goodly plant, that from the vine it once was, now is grown unsightly bramble, unquote. Petrarch dwells repeatedly with more amplification on the same theme. We quote only the first and last stanzas of his sonnet on the Church of Rome. Quote, the fire of wrathful heaven alight, and all thy harlot tresses smite. Base city, thou from humble fare, thy acorns and thy water rose to greatness, rich with others' woes, rejoicing in the ruin thou didst bear, unquote. Quote, in former days thou wast not laid on down, nor under cooling shade, thou naked to the winds was given, and thou the sharp and thorny road, thy feet without thy sandals trod, but now thy life in such it smells to heaven, unquote. There is something here out of the ordinary course. We have no desire to detract from the worldly wisdom of the popes. They were, in that respect, the ablest race of rulers the world ever saw. Their enterprise soared as high above the vastest scheme of other potentates and conquerors as their ostensible means of achieving it fell below theirs. To build such a fabric of dominion upon the gospel, every line of which repudiates and condemns it, to impose it upon the world without an army and without a fleet, to bow the necks not of ignorant peoples only, but of mighty potentates to it, nay, to persuade the latter to assist in establishing a power which they could hardly but foresee would clash themselves, to pursue this scheme through a succession of centuries without once meeting any serious check or repulse. For the 130 popes between Boniface III, 606, who, in partnership with Phocas, laid the foundations of papal grandeur, and Gregory VII, who realized it onward through other 2 centuries to Pope Innocent III, 1216, and Pope Boniface VIII in 1303, who at last put the top stone on it. Not one lost an inch of ground which his predecessor had gained. To do all this, we repeat something out of the ordinary course. There is nothing like it again in the whole history of the world. This success, though 7 centuries, was audaciously interpreted into a proof of the divinity of the papacy. Behold, it had been said, when the throne of Caesar was overturned, how the chair of Peter stood erect. Behold, when the barbarous nations rushed like a torrent into Italy, overwhelming laws, extinguishing knowledge, and dissolving society itself, how the ark of the church rode in safety on the flood. Behold, when the victorious hosts of the Saracen approached the gates of Italy, how they were turned back. Behold, when the mitre waged its great contest with the empire, how it triumphed. Behold, when the Reformation broke out, and it seemed as if the kingdom of the Pope was numbered and finished, how 3 centuries have been added to its sway. Behold, in fine, when revolution broke out in France and swept like a whirlwind over Europe, bearing down thrones and dynasties, how the bark of Peter outlived the storm and rode triumphant over the waves that engulfed apparently stronger structures. Is it not the church of which Christ said, quote, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, unquote? What else do the words of Cardinal Baronius mean? Baronius. What else do the words of the what else do the words of Cardinal Baronius mean? Boasting of a supposed donation of the kingdom of Hungary and to the Roman See by Stephen, he says, quote, it fell out by a wonderful providence of God that at the very time when the Roman Church might appear ready to fall and perish, even then distant kings approached the apostolic see, which they acknowledge and venerate as the only temple of the universe, the sanctuary of piety, the pillar of truth, the immovable rock. Behold, kings, not from the east as of old they came to the cradle of Christ, but from the north, led by faith as they humbly approached the cottage of the fisher, the church of Rome herself, offering not only gifts out of their treasures, but bringing even kingdoms to her and asking kingdoms from her. Whoso is wise and will record these things, even he shall understand the loving kindness of the Lord, unquote. But the success of the papacy was closely examined. It is not surprising as it looks. It is not so surprising as it looks. It cannot be justly pronounced legitimate or fairly won. Rome has ever been swimming with the tide. The evils and passions of society, which a true benefactress would have made it her business to cure, at least to alleviate. Rome has studied rather to foster into strength than she might be borne to power on the foul current which she herself had created. Amid battles, bloodshed, and confusion has her path lain. The edicts of subservient councils, the forgeries of hireling priests, the arms of craven monarchs, and the thunderbolts of excommunication have never been wanting to open her path. Exploits won by weapons of this sort are what her historians delight to chronicle. These are the victories that constitute her glory. And then there remains yet another and great deduction from the apparent grandeur of her success, in that, after all, it is the success of only a few, a caste, the clergy. For although during her early career the Roman Church rendered certain important services to society, of which it will delight us to make mention in fitting place, when she grew to maturity and was able to develop her real genius, it was felt and acknowledged by all that her principles implied the ruin of all interest to save her own, and that there was room in the world for none but herself. If her march, as shown in history down to the 16th century, is ever onwards, it is not less true that behind on her path lie the wrecks of nations, the ashes of literature, of liberty, and of civilization. Nor can we help observing that the career of Rome, with all the fictitious brilliance that encompasses it, is utterly eclipsed when placed beside the silent and sublime progress of the gospel. The latter, that is the gospel, we see winning its way over mighty obstacles solely by the force and sweetness of its own truth. It touches the deep wounds of society only to heal them. It speaks not to awaken, but to hush the rough voice of strife and war. It enlightens, purifies, and blesses men whenever it comes, and it does all this so gently and unboastingly. Reviled, it reviles not again. For it curses, it returns blessings. It unsheathes no sword, it spills no blood. Cast into chains, its victories are as many as when free and more glorious, dragged to the stake and burned from the ashes of the martyrs, there start up 1,000 confessors to speed on its career and swell the glory of its triumph. Compared with this, how different has been the career of Rome. As different, in fact, as the thundercloud which comes onward, mantling the skies in the gloom and scathing the earth with fiery bolts, is different from the morning descending from the mountaintop, scattering around it the silvery light, and awakening at its presence songs of joy. And that ends our chapter in the reading of this history, development of the papacy from Gregory VII to Boniface VIII. Now, I want to go over what we had covered earlier about the thoroughly ecclesiastical. Okay. This is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and let's just quick delve into it for a moment. Ecclesiology, if we look this up, it speaks of its early history. One of the church's primary eschatological issues had to do with the statutes of Gentile members in what had become the New Testament fulfillment of the essentially Jewish Old Testament church. Okay, so what they're referring to here is in the book of Acts, right? When the gospel went to the Gentiles through Stephen, the martyrhood of Stephen. And later it contended with such questions as whether it was to be governed by a council of presbyters or a single bishop. How much authority the Bishop of Rome had over other major bishops, the role of the church in the world, whether salvation was possible outside the institution. Okay, and we go la da 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 da. But essentially, we get to something called Catholic ecclesiology. Okay, so this is not a small topic. This is a big one. Catholic ecclesiology today is a plurality of models and views, as with all Catholic theology, since the acceptance of scholarly biblical criticism that began in the early to mid 20th century. This shift is most clearly marked in the encyclical Divino Finite Spiritu in 1943. Avery Robert Cardinal Dulles, S.J., contributed greatly to the use of the models in understanding ecclesiology. In his work, Models of the Church, he defines 5 basic models of the Church that have been prevalent throughout the history of the Catholic Church. These include models of the Church as institution, as mystical communion, as sacrament, as herald, and as servant. The ecclesiological model of church as an institution holds that the Catholic Church alone is the, quote, one holy Catholic and apostolic church, unquote, and is the only church of divine and apostolic origin led by the Pope. This is true. This view is the church is dogmatically defined Catholic doctrine, and is therefore de fide. In this view, the Catholic Church, composed of all baptized professing Catholics, both clergy and laity, is the unified, visible society founded by Christ himself. Wrong! And its hierarchy derives its spiritual authority through the centuries via apostolic succession of its bishops, most especially through the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, whose successorship comes from St. Peter the Apostle, to whom Christ, quote unquote, gave the keys to the kingdom of heaven, unquote. Thus, the popes, in the Catholic view, have a God-ordained universal jurisdiction over the whole church of the earth. The Catholic Church is considered Christ's mystical body and the universal sacrament of salvation, whereby Christ enables human to receive sanctifying grace. Okay, notice the key word here, human. So, it's very interesting when you look up humanity and, an old dictionary. I have an old Oxford dictionary, and I happen to look up the word humanity here. And, early on when I started looking into this, it appeared that there was something incredibly strange here going on, because the human race is referred to as mankind in 1579. Well, I think we had the Council of Trent going around 1570 or something. And that's interesting. Also, it says here in part 2 under humanity that this is one of the classes in a Jesuit school. So, yeah, that has something to do with it. But, when you take this further and you look up, the philosophical term of human is humanism. And humanism states here that along with humanist used in a variety of philosophical and theological senses in the 16th and 18th centuries, especially ones concerned with the mere humanity of Christ. So what do you do when you make Christ human? You take away his divinity. And that's exactly what they have done. They have taken away the divine purpose of Christ. That's why when Pope Francis said, when he came to Greek Congress here in the United States back in 2015, he had said that humanly speaking, the Christ, what do you say? How do you say it? Humanly speaking, Christ's sacrifice on the cross ended in failure. Something to that degree. Yeah.
He
I
failed
can't
on the
remember
cross,
exactly.
I think it was.
Yeah. He stated that Christ failed at the cross. Well, humanly speaking, he failed because he was not divine. That's what the Pope is telling you.
Mm.
Because, when you really grasp the humanity aspect, they're essentially just using Christ. They don't have any real faith in the divinity of Christ. Obviously, this is just usurpation. They're taking the place of Christ, aren't they, Michael?
Yeah, but no wonder, because it's the only path that you could claim this apostolic succession. And when you talked about about the stoning of Stephen,
yes,
in the context of, please help me out.
Oh yeah, the context at the beginning here, with the that would be.
No, that was in a text from this book, The History of Protestantism.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Now you talked about this kind of like that was the stoning of Stephen, when then the gospel then was preached. Actually, that the stoning of Stephen was in chapter 8, and if I remember correctly, was it in chapter 8? I have to look it up. But what I really know is that the gospel then went to the Gentiles after Saul, then called Paul, said to the Jews, "I'm sorry, because you do not want to hear it," and it is in 1346. Then Paul and Barnabas waxed bold and said it was necessary that the word of God should first have been spoken to you, speaking of the Jews.
Yep.
But seeing ye put it from you and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, we turn to the Gentiles. So it was Paul who then decided that the gospel should have been preached to the Gentiles. So it is clearly Paul, former Saul, who is the apostle to the Gentiles.
Correct.
So therefore,
yes.
Peter could not be the apostle to the Gentiles. Yeah. So, but Rome, these Romans, they were Gentiles.
Yeah.
They were not Jews. Yeah. Right. So therefore, they are totally apostolic succession is an absolutely fabrication, which you see also in Acts chapter 13.
Right. Yeah.
It's just, I want to back up your claims.
Yeah. I think wasn't Acts chapter 8 with that has to do with Simon Magus. Yeah.
I'm just looking.
It's a very, very, very good study, the Book of Acts. But yeah, that was here in the early. It's in this sentence here. In its early history, one of the church's primary ecclesiological issues had to do with the status of Gentile members in what had become the New Testament fulfillment of the essentially Jewish Old Testament church. That's what I was referring to.
Okay, I have to correct myself a bit, because it was Acts chapter 7 what the stoning of Stephen was.
Yes.
But
okay.
You see that it's just hard to recollect everything in one's brain.
It's close enough, though, Michael. Thank you for bringing it up.
But the point is that the apostolic succession is totally a fabrication, because you know that Peter was not the apostle man to be preaching to the Gentiles.
You're correct. You're absolutely correct.
Rome was ever
They're mixing it all up.
The enemy of the Jews.
Yeah, they're just trying to confuse all of Christendom. Of course, I mean that's their purpose, because they want to take away your ability to read and think for yourself.
To claim that Rome is the epicenter of the so-called Christian belief, would be the same as you would claim that what else to say? That Moscow is the capital city of the United States.
Yeah, that's right. It's absolutely it's a joke.
It's beyond
it's
any belief. You see, when I was young, and I knew that that there was a Roman soldier who put his spear into Jesus' side.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so and that Rome was responsible for destroying the temple in 70 AD. So how can anybody come up with the great illusion that Rome is the epicenter of Christianity, so-called Christianity? I could not. When I was a juvenile, I said, okay, now I'm sorry, this is not the Church of Jesus Christ, because they are just simply too wealthy.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, there's a lot of contradictions there, and if you just go with the tradition of it all, you just accept it all and blindly, oh yeah, well, they got to be right. Look how successful they are.
Yeah, but
that kind of thing.
This book is so interesting because every time that you're reading the book, not only because you're a native English speaker or American speaker, but it is just this elaborate, eloquent English.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which you don't hear on any news today or any regular sources today. You see that this is really these reformers, or not reformers. It's a bad word maybe because it cannot be reformed. These Protestants.
Yes.
That I think that the better word for that is evangelicals. Yeah,
Sure.
Because these people who are just keeping busy with the truth and with all the content of the Bible, these are really the people who are just want to have some science, some knowledge in it. They are just much more professed in, how to say that in English?
Well, let's say it's science in the sense that we're pursuing a righteous science here. This is the study of what is God's word? What is God's purpose? What does he say in scripture? What does he really say? I always wanted to know this, and this is something that we all need to wrestle with. It's not something that is just going to be easily given to you like on a silver platter. No, you have to go figure it out and do your own research, right? I mean, you have to own this truth. It's not something that you can easily acquire. It takes study. It takes, obviously, it took James Aitken Wylie a great amount of study to come to these conclusions. But I'm really, really happy that we have this text that was put together by Alec there at Lutheran Bible Library. lutheranlibrary.org, excuse me. And it's great. I mean, I really feel like finally something to get a grasp on, what's really happened in the past. So
I think the big difference, Brett, is also I'm not talking now about the priests or the pastors or whomsoever else in the clergy, but for the layman. I think that among the evangelicals, or at least it should be, these people are just knowing their Bible. And I see from the majority, which are in the big churches, especially Catholics, they don't read their Bible. They're just following the sermon on their priest and say, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And they don't care about much for the Bible. And that's a sad thing. I think that's why they are so deluded.
Right. Well, when you sit there and listen to Latin all day and you don't even care what they're saying, I mean, they're singing songs to Lucifer there in the church. I mean, you'd think that they'd actually get it, but they don't, because it's just the God of this world. Big difference between the God of this world and the God of glory in heaven. Big difference there. You can worship the God of this world. Yes, you can think he's righteous. Yes. But when it comes down to the end of the day, it's different, because you have a form of righteousness. It's not that it's righteous. It's a form of righteousness. And you need to know where the history of that church started and how they have deceived you, because we're not to let men deceive us. That's what Jesus commanded us. We're not to just sit there and listen to what anyone has to say. Just go and prove it with your own research, and don't believe them because they said it. Don't believe just because they said it's true. It doesn't mean it's true. You got to prove it. You have to check it. You have to make sure of it before. I mean, that's what faith is all about, is actually proving through various testimonies, whether it's true or false. That's not an easy process either. But yeah, next time we're going to come to the medieval Protestant witness. God willing, we make it here next week. And be looking forward to joining up with you, Michael, if you're available. And we'll see what the future brings, because there's a lot of talk right now. I was watching some video last night about cyber attacks, and a lot of rhetoric going on right now about the fragility of the whole financial network and all of that. So I think it's pretty obvious that we're in for something big here in the next couple of years. So we'll see what happens, but God willing, we'll meet every week and continue in our reading and discussion of the history of Protestantism. Thanks for joining me, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.